The machines were the only sound in the room. A steady beep, a hiss of oxygen, the low electric hum of a hospital at 11 at night. Natalie Parker lay against the raised pillow, with a cast running from her wrist to her elbow, and a bandage taped along her hairline. And she was staring at the door the way she'd stared at boardroom doors her whole career. Waiting for someone to walk through it who mattered. No one had. Then the door opened anyway. And it wasn't a board member, and it wasn't her chief of staff, and it wasn't the man she'd been engaged to for 4 months before he quietly stopped returning her calls. The same week, the story about her accident hit the local news. It was Jack Sullivan. The machines were the only sound in the room. A steady beep, a hiss of oxygen, the low electric hum of a hospital at 11 at night. Natalie Parker lay against the raised pillow, with a cast running from her wrist to her elbow, and a bandage taped along her hairline. And she was staring at the door the way she'd stared at boardroom doors her whole career. Waiting for someone to walk through it who mattered. No one had. Then the door opened anyway. And it wasn't a board member, and it wasn't her chief of staff, and it wasn't the man she'd been engaged to for 4 months before he quietly stopped returning her calls. The same week, the story about her accident hit the local news. It was Jack Sullivan, the warehouse manager she had fired 8 days earlier, standing in the doorway in a jacket still spotted with rain, holding a plastic container with a dish towel wrapped around it to keep it warm, and beside him, gripping 2 fingers of his free hand, was a 9-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat, holding a folded piece of construction paper, like it was something fragile. Natalie's mouth opened, before her mind caught up to it. "What are you doing here?" It wasn't a question so much as a door slamming, the last defensive reflex of a woman who had spent a week finding out exactly who did and didn't show up for her. Jack didn't flinch. He set the container down on the rolling table at the foot of the bed, gently, the way you'd set down something you were embarrassed to be holding. "Emma made you a card," he said. "She wanted to bring soup, too, so we brought soup." The girl stepped forward and held out the card without a word, and on the front of it, in marker, was a badly drawn son wearing sunglasses, and underneath it, in careful 9-year-old handwriting, "Get well soon, Miss Natalie. My dad says you're tough." Natalie looked at the card, then at soup, steam still rising faintly when Jack peeled back the towel. Then at Jack, who wasn't looking at her with anything like triumph or vindication or even much expression at all. Just a kind of quiet patience, like a man waiting to see if he was still welcome in a room he had every reason to never walk into again. To find out how a man wrongfully fired ended up the only person who showed up for the woman who fired him, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, the ones about people who get overlooked and underestimated, right up until the moment it matters most, means something to you, we'd love to hear it in the comments. So many of you watching have lived a version of this yourselves. There's an old argument that never quite settles, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Whether real loyalty belongs to the company you work for, or only to the people inside it who actually deserve it. Jack Sullivan was about to answer that question with his actions instead of his words, which was the only way he ever answered anything. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Not the accident, not the firing, not the card with the crooked sun on it. 3 years ago, Jack Sullivan was simply the best warehouse operations manager Meridian Freight Logistics had ever had, and almost nobody at the executive level knew his first name. He'd come to Meridian 9 years earlier as a floor associate, the kind of hire nobody remembers making, and within 4 years he'd been promoted to manager of the company's largest distribution hub, a 300,000 square foot facility outside the city that moved 11,000 pallets a week. He ran it the way he ran everything, quietly, early, and without complaint. He arrived before 6 and left after the trucks did. He knew the names of all 62 people on his floor, and their kids' names, and which ones were working a second job to cover rent. He had turned around the worst-performing hub in the regional network into the best one in 18 months, and he had done it without ever once putting his own name on the credit. That mattered to Jack, the not taking credit part, more than anyone realized. 4 years earlier, his wife Diane had died of an aggressive cancer 11 weeks after diagnosis, leaving him with a 5-year-old daughter, a mortgage, and a company health plan he could not afford to lose. He had learned, in the year that followed, exactly how thin the line was between a stable life and a collapsed one, and he had built his entire professional posture around never letting anyone at Meridian have a reason to notice him too much. Steady, reliable, invisible. A man who kept his head down because his daughter's whole world depended on his paycheck landing in the same account on the same day every 2 weeks, and he was not going to be the reason it didn't. Natalie Parker had taken over as CEO of Meridian 18 months earlier. The youngest person and the first woman to run the company in its 41-year history, brought in by a board that wanted growth after a decade of flat performance. She was 39, sharp enough to make experienced executives nervous in meetings, and under more pressure than anyone outside her direct reports understood. Meridian was 6 weeks from finalizing a $320 million logistics contract with a national retail chain, a deal that would double the company's revenue and, not incidentally, secure Natalie's position against a board that had been quietly discussing alternative leadership in a text thread she wasn't supposed to know existed. She had built walls a long time ago. Natalie had, brick by brick, starting with a father who told her ambition was unbecoming in a girl, and continuing through a decade of being the only woman in rooms where men assumed her chair belonged to someone's assistant. She had learned that warmth got mistaken for weakness, and so she had traded most of it away for precision, and the deal in front of her now was the kind of thing precision was supposed to protect, which was exactly why when the leak happened she moved so fast. 3 weeks before the contract's final signature window, confidential pricing structures from the retail deal turned up in the hands of Meridian's chief regional competitor. It wasn't a rumor. It was in a competing bid, word for word, numbers that had existed on exactly 4 laptops in the company. The board wanted a name within 72 hours. Natalie wanted one faster than that. And the man who brought her a name, calm, regretful, almost gentle about it, was David Whitfield, Senior Vice President of Operations, 44 years old, Ivy League MBA. The kind of executive who could make a threat sound like concern. David had built his career at Meridian on being the person who delivered bad news smoothly, and he delivered this news to Natalie in her office with the door closed, laying a printed access log on her desk like he hated having to do it. The log showed a login from Jack Sullivan's warehouse terminal at 11:47 p.m., accessing a shared drive folder containing the pricing structure documents 3 days before the leak surfaced. David hadn't said Jack did it. That was the skill of it. David never said things outright. He'd said, almost sadly, that he didn't want to believe it either, that Jack had always seemed like a good man, but that the access logs didn't lie, and that in a deal this size, Natalie couldn't afford to be sentimental about who she trusted. Natalie had looked at that log for 4 seconds. 4 seconds against 9 years of a man's work, and then she had picked up the phone and told her assistant to get Jack Sullivan into her office within the hour. The girl in the yellow raincoat, 3 years from that moment, had not been born into any of this yet as a fact Natalie knew. But the sun on the crooked construction paper card was already, in some sense, on its way, because everything that was about to go wrong for Jack Sullivan was about to happen for a reason that had nothing to do with betrayal, and everything to do with the same instinct that had made him invisible in the first place. Protecting somebody smaller than himself. He had no idea, walking into Natalie Parker's office that afternoon, that he was about to lose the only job he had, in defense of a secret he had chosen to keep entirely on his own. Natalie's office was glass on 2 sides, high enough up that the warehouse floor, Jack managed, was a gray rectangle in the distance. When he looked out the window while he waited for her to finish reading, she didn't offer him a seat. That detail would come back to her later, in the hospital, more than almost anything else. The fact that she had made a man who'd worked there 9 years stand. "I'm going to ask you once," she said, "and I want the truth, because I don't have time for anything else. Did you access the retail pricing files on the shared drive on the 14th? Jack didn't move much when he was thinking. It was one of the things people who'd worked under him had learned to read. The stillness meant he was choosing his words, not that he had none. "Yes," he said, "I did." Something in Natalie's chest tightened, the particular tightness of being right about something you didn't want to be right about. Why? And here was the moment that would define the next year of both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. Jack could have told her the truth. The truth was that Priya Reyes, a 26-year-old logistics coordinator on his floor, 11 weeks postpartum with a son who'd been born 6 weeks early, and was still, at that point, making trips back to the NICU, had come to him in a panic 2 nights earlier. She'd been asked by David Whitfield's assistant. She'd assumed the request came from David himself, and maybe it had, though nobody would ever prove that, to pull a document from the shared drive using her login, late at night, from home, because Priya sometimes worked remotely on data entry to be near her son. She hadn't known what the folder contained. She'd pulled it, sent it where she was told to send it, and 2 days later realized, with the sick lurch of someone who understands too late, that she'd been used. She'd come to Jack sobbing in the break room before her shift, certain she was about to be fired, with a newborn in the NICU and a maternity leave she couldn't afford to lose the tail end of. And Jack, who knew exactly what losing a paycheck at the wrong moment could do to a family with a small child in it, because he had lived that exact catastrophe himself, had done the only thing he could think to do fast enough to matter. He'd logged into the shared drive himself, late that same night, from his own terminal, layering his own access on top of hers in the system logs, muddying the trail just enough, he hoped, that if anyone came looking, it would look like a mistake made by a manager checking on a report, not a coordinator sending confidential pricing data outside the building on someone else's instruction. He hadn't leaked anything. He'd simply made himself the visible name in a system he understood better than almost anyone in that building, to buy Priya cover. He didn't tell Natalie any of it, not one word. "I was checking the folder structure," he said instead. "That's all I'm going to say about it." Natalie stared at him. In another version of this story, she asks a second question. She asks why a warehouse manager would need to check the folder structure of a confidential executive drive at midnight. And something in that question might have cracked the whole thing open right there, might have made her curious instead of certain. But she was 6 weeks from a $320 million deadline, and a board that was watching her for the first sign of instability, and a senior VP she'd trusted for a year and a half sitting 2 floors down waiting for a decision, and certainty was so much easier to hold than curiosity. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the one I've got. Then I don't have a choice." Her voice had gone flat, the register she used to end negotiations. "Effective today, you're terminated. Security will walk you out. I'm sorry it has to be this way, Jack, I mean that. But I can't have someone in a position of trust who won't explain himself, not with what's riding on this quarter." Jack nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to reconsider, didn't point out 9 years of overtime nobody made him work, didn't mention that he'd once driven back to the warehouse at 2 a.m. during an ice storm because a refrigerated truck's compressor had failed, and 11 pallets of pharmaceutical shipments were on the line. He simply said, "Understood," and turned and walked out of the glass office past people on the floor below, who would spend the rest of the week whispering about what he must have done, because nobody except Natalie and David knew the actual accusation, and rumor fills a vacuum faster than truth ever can. 2 floors down in the break room, Priya Reyes watched him go and said nothing, because she was terrified. And because Jack, in the 30 seconds he had alone with her near the elevator bank before security arrived, had told her, quietly, not to say a word. "You've got a baby in the NICU," he'd said. "You can't afford this fight right now. I can." It wasn't bravado. It was arithmetic. He had savings. She didn't. He was one income supporting 2 people who were at least both healthy. She was one income supporting a family in crisis. He had made the calculation the way he made every calculation, fast and quiet and entirely in someone else's favor. He drove home that afternoon and sat in the car outside his house for 11 minutes before he went in, because Emma was going to ask how work was, the way she always did, and he needed a version of the truth that wouldn't scare her. When he finally walked in, she was doing homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up and said, "You're home early," and Jack said, "Yeah. I got some extra time off," and Emma, 9 years old and sharper than most adults gave her credit for, studied his face for a second too long before going back to her math worksheet, filing something away without saying it out loud. Nobody at Meridian ever learned the real reason. David Whitfield, watching from his office as the news moved through the building, felt something settle in his chest that he chose to call relief and not guilt, though it was mostly the second thing. He had needed the leak trace somewhere that wasn't back to him, and Jack Sullivan, quiet, uncomplaining, easy to write off as a man with something to hide, had made himself, without ever meaning to, the perfect place for that trail to end. It would be 8 months before the crack in that story finally started to show, and it would not begin with Jack Sullivan at all. It would begin, of all places, on a stretch of wet highway at 7 in the evening with Natalie Parker's car spinning across 2 lanes of traffic in the rain. If you've ever been the one who took the blame so someone smaller than you didn't have to carry it, you already know exactly what it cost Jack to stay quiet in that room. And we'd love to hear about it if you want to share. The accident made the local news for one cycle and then disappeared. The way these things do, a photo of a crumpled sedan, a line about a CEO in critical but stable condition, a company statement about wishing her a full and speedy recovery, signed by a board that had already, within 48 hours, opened a private conversation about interim leadership. Natalie spent the first 3 days in the ICU mostly unconscious, and when she woke fully on the 4th, the first thing she noticed, before the pain in her wrist, before the stitches along her hairline, was who wasn't there. Her fiancé, Marcus, came once for 11 minutes, checked his phone twice, and left saying he had a work thing, and then didn't come back. He texted twice over the following week, each message shorter than the last, and Natalie understood, with the particular clarity that comes from lying flat on your back, with nothing else to do but think, that whatever they'd had was built on the version of her that never needed anything, and that version was currently in a hospital bed, with a cast on her arm. Her board sent flowers, an enormous arrangement, white lilies, a card signed with 6 names in the same handwriting, which told her someone's assistant had signed all 6. David Whitfield sent a text. Thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything handled while you're out. Nothing about coming by. Nothing that wasn't, underneath the concern, a question about who was running things. Nobody came. 9 days. And nobody who had built a life alongside her for the past 18 months walked through that door. And then, on the 9th day, Jack Sullivan did. With his daughter, with soup and a card. Natalie didn't sleep much that first night after they left. She kept the card propped against the water pitcher, on her tray table, the crooked sun catching the light from the hallway every time a nurse opened the door. And she found herself, at 2 in the morning, doing something she hadn't done in longer than she wanted to admit. Actually thinking, carefully and without an agenda, about the day she'd fired him. She remembered the 4 seconds she'd looked at that access log. She remembered that she hadn't asked a second question. She remembered, with a discomfort that surprised her, that Jack hadn't defended himself even once, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done any of the things a guilty man protecting himself does, and hadn't done any of the things an innocent man protecting himself does either. He had just said understood and walked out, and at the time she had read that as guilt, and now, lying in a hospital bed with a body that wouldn't move the way she told it to, she found herself reading it as something else entirely. As a man absorbing a hit for someone, she didn't know who yet, but she knew, with the same instinct that had built her career, that something about that afternoon 8 months earlier had never quite added up, and she had simply been too busy to let herself notice. Jack and Emma came back 3 days later, and again the following week. Emma had appointed herself, without asking anyone's permission, as Natalie's unofficial recovery coordinator, arriving with a new drawing every visit, a cat wearing a superhero cape, a garden with flowers and colors that didn't exist in nature, a get well message, spelled with 1 letter reversed, that Natalie found she looked forward to finding more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her week. Jack said little, brought soup or bread, or once a small potted plant he said wouldn't die even if you forgot about it for a while, which made Natalie laugh for the first time in 2 weeks, a real laugh surprised out of her. She asked him once, on the 4th visit, why he kept coming. She hadn't meant to ask it so bluntly, but the painkillers made her filter thinner than usual. Jack considered the question the way he considered everything, with that stillness. You were alone, he said. Nobody should be alone in a place like this. And then, because it was true and he didn't see the point in dressing it up, it's not about the job. There is an old and stubborn belief, in workplaces and outside them, that a man who works with his hands and never climbs the ladder must have less to offer than a man with initials after his name. That competence follows credentials rather than character. Jack Sullivan had spent 9 years quietly proving otherwise on a warehouse floor nobody from the executive suite ever walked, and he was about to prove it again in a hospital room for a woman who had every reason to expect he'd never speak to her again. The real crack, though, the one that would eventually bring the whole thing down, started somewhere Natalie couldn't see. In a NICU 3 miles from the hospital where she lay recovering, where Priya Reyes sat beside an incubator, holding her son's tiny hand through the porthole, and finally, after 8 months of silence, told her husband the entire story, start to finish, because she could not carry it alone any longer. Her husband, a quiet man named Marcus Reyes, who worked in IT for a hospital system and had a very particular set of professional habits around documentation, asked her one question that changed everything. "Do you still have the message where David's assistant asked you to pull that folder?" She did. She'd never deleted it. She hadn't known why she'd kept it. Some instinct, some small voice telling her it might matter someday. It mattered now. Back at Meridian, in the vacuum left by Natalie's absence, David Whitfield was not having the recovery he expected either. With the CEO out and the board nervous, he had quietly begun positioning himself as the obvious interim choice, working the room with the retail contract's remaining negotiators, dropping hints in hallway conversations about stability during a difficult transition. But the retail deal, the one that was supposed to be Meridian's crowning achievement, had developed a problem nobody outside 3 people knew about yet. A second leak, smaller, sloppier, this one traceable in a way the first one never should have been. Because David had gotten comfortable, and comfortable men make mistakes that careful men don't. Natalie, still in her hospital bed, still 2 weeks from discharge, had no idea any of this was in motion. She knew only that a man she'd fired 8 months earlier kept showing up with his daughter and asking nothing of her in return, and that the more time she spent with him, the less the story she'd built in her head 8 months ago made any sense at all. She asked him, on what would turn out to be her last week in the hospital, if he would consider coming back, his old job, or something better, whatever it took. She said it carefully, watching his face, half expecting him to say yes immediately and half hoping, though she couldn't have said why, that he wouldn't. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, not unkindly, just certain. I appreciate it. But you fired me over something I wasn't going to explain then, and I'm still not going to explain it now. I don't think you should offer someone their job back, because they brought you soup. That's not a good enough reason for either of us." It would be 2 more months before Natalie found out why he'd really refused, and what he had actually been protecting the whole time. 2 months in which an ordinary Tuesday morning at Meridian's headquarters would blow the entire story open. In a boardroom Jack Sullivan wasn't even in the building to see. Here's a question worth sitting with either way. Was it right for Jack to protect Priya by staying silent for 8 straight months, even at the cost of his own name? Or should he have trusted someone, anyone, with the truth sooner? People land on both sides of that one, and there's no wrong answer, just different instincts about what protecting someone actually looks like. The Tuesday it happened. Natalie was 3 weeks out of the hospital, working half days against her doctor's advice, her cast down to a smaller brace on her wrist, when her assistant put through a call she hadn't been expecting, from Marcus Reyes, a name she didn't immediately place, asking for 15 minutes. He came in with his wife. Priya sat down across from Natalie's desk, looking like a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times and still wasn't ready for it. And she told the whole story in under 10 minutes, start to finish, her voice shaking only once, when she got to the part about Jack finding her crying in the break room and telling her, quietly, that he'd handle it. She had the message, David's assistant's name on it, the timestamp, the folder name, everything. Marcus had already had it forensically preserved, metadata intact, nothing that could be dismissed as fabricated after the fact. Natalie read it twice. Then she sat to hew still for almost a full minute, the way Jack sat still when he was thinking, though she'd have been embarrassed to notice the resemblance. He never said a word, she said finally, mostly to herself. He told me not to, Priya said. He said I couldn't afford the fight. He said he could. What happened over the following 6 weeks moved with the particular speed Natalie was known for when she stopped hesitating. She brought in outside counsel, quietly, before David knew anything was happening. She pulled the full access logs from that period, not the selectively presented summary David had handed her 8 months earlier, but the complete record, cross-referenced against building badge swipes, VPN sessions, and the assistant's own device logs, which the assistant, once questioned separately and given assurance she wasn't the target, handed over without much resistance at all. The picture that emerged was almost embarrassingly clear once someone actually looked for it. David Whitfield had directed the original leak through Priya's account, using his assistant as an intermediary specifically so his own name would never touch the request directly, and had then, when the leak was discovered, handed Natalie a printout that told a true fact. Jack's login existed in the logs, while omitting the fact that David himself had reason to know exactly why, and exactly whose account was really involved. It also turned out that the second leak, the sloppier one during Natalie's hospital stay, was David again, this time growing careless with confidence, trying to smooth over a pricing discrepancy in the retail contract by sharing figures with an industry contact who turned out to be far less discreet than David had assumed. Natalie confronted him on a Thursday afternoon in the same glass-walled office where she'd once told Jack he was terminated. And this time it was David standing while she remained seated, watching the color drain out of a face that had built an entire career on staying composed under pressure. He tried the same soft, regretful register he'd used on her 8 months earlier. "I don't know what you think you've found, Natalie, but I'd be careful about." And it didn't land, not this time, because she had the documents in front of her, and she had spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed, learning the difference between a man who explains himself smoothly and a man who simply tells the truth. David Whitfield was terminated that afternoon and referred to the board's audit committee, and within the month, word of the actual story, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, began moving through the building he'd once run half of. But Natalie didn't wait for the formal process before she went to find Jack. She drove to his house herself, no assistant, no announcement, in the evening, and found him in the driveway checking the air in Emma's bicycle tires, while Emma sat on the front step doing homework in the last of the daylight. He straightened up when he saw her car, wary in a way that made something in Natalie's chest hurt in a way she hadn't expected. "I know what happened," she said, before he could say anything at all. "I know about Priya. I know why you didn't explain yourself. I know you took 8 months of people thinking you were a thief, so a woman with a baby in the NICU didn't lose her income during the worst stretch of her life." Her voice wavered, which almost never happened, and she let it. "I fired a good man because I was too rushed to ask a second question. And you let me believe I was right about it for 8 months, because you were protecting someone who needed protecting more than your own name did. I don't know how to apologize for that in a way that's big enough." Jack set down the bicycle. He didn't say anything for a moment, and Emma, watching from the step, had gone quiet too, sensing this was one of those grown-up moments you weren't supposed to interrupt even if you desperately wanted to. "You don't have to make it big," Jack said finally. "You just have to mean it small." It wasn't forgiveness delivered all at once, the way it sometimes goes in a story that wants a clean turn. It was the start of something slower, an acknowledgement, offered and received, between two people who had both spent a long time being careful not to need anyone. But something had shifted in that driveway, visibly, in the way Jack's shoulders came down half an inch, in the way Natalie didn't get back in her car for another 20 minutes, in the way Emma eventually got up from the step and, without a word, brought Natalie a glass of lemonade like she'd simply decided, on her own authority, that Natalie belonged there now. 6 weeks would pass. 6 weeks of Meridian's board quietly absorbing the truth about David Whitfield. 6 weeks of a company-wide announcement being drafted and redrafted. 6 weeks of Jack still saying no to every version of his old job that Natalie offered him. Before the truth came out publicly, in front of every person who had once watched Jack Sullivan walked out of the building by security. At the all-hands meeting, Natalie called specifically to make sure nobody in that room was ever confused again about who Jack Sullivan actually was. The all-hands meeting was held in the largest space Meridian had, the same warehouse floor Jack had once run, folding chairs set up between the racking. 300 employees crowded in, because word had already gotten around that Natalie was making some kind of announcement and nobody wanted to miss it. Jack hadn't wanted to come. Natalie had asked him anyway, not as an executive summoning an employee, but as herself, standing in his kitchen the night before, saying simply, I need people to hear it from you being there, not just from me talking about you like you're not in the room." He came. Emma came with him, in a dress she'd chosen herself for the occasion, sitting in the front row swinging her feet because they didn't reach the floor. Natalie stood without notes. She told the room, plainly and without softening any part of it, that 8 months earlier she had fired a man for something he hadn't done, based on evidence that had been deliberately shaped to protect the real person responsible, and that the man she'd fired had known the truth the entire time and said nothing, because saying something would have cost a young mother with a newborn in intensive care the paycheck she needed to survive the worst months of her life. She named David Whitfield. She named what he'd done, plainly, the way she should have investigated it the first time. And then she looked directly at Jack, sitting in the front row with his daughter beside him, and said that the company owed him not just his job back, but an apology that no title change could fully cover, and that she intended to spend a long time making sure Meridian became the kind of place where a man wouldn't have to choose between his own name and someone else's survival ever again. The applause that followed wasn't polite applause. It went on long enough that Jack looked, for the first time in the entire meeting, genuinely uncomfortable, and Emma reached over and took his hand, and he held on to it like it was the thing keeping him upright. Natalie offered him, formally, a senior operations directorship, an office, a title, a seat at the leadership table, more money than he'd made in his life. Jack thanked her, in front of everyone, and then declined it, in front of everyone too, which made David's old allies in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats, and made everyone else lean forward. "I don't want an office," he said. "I want the floor. I want a policy. Real, written down, not a poster in the break room, that says nobody at this company ever has to choose between telling the truth and keeping their kids' insurance. Put my name on that instead of a door." Natalie built it. The Sullivan Protocol, employees started calling it within a year, an internal whistleblower and hardship protection framework that guaranteed continued pay and benefits during any internal investigation for any employee who came forward with information in good faith, regardless of what that information cost them personally. Priya Reyes helped write the parental leave provisions herself, sitting in a conference room with a healthy toddler on her lap 18 months later, a very different room than the one where she'd once confessed everything, with her voice shaking. Jack went back to running the warehouse floor, exactly the job he'd asked for, and somehow, without either of them ever quite deciding it out loud, Natalie started finding reasons to walk that floor herself more often than any CEO before her ever had. Months later, quiet ones, unremarkable in the way real recovery usually is. There was an evening in early autumn when Natalie sat on Jack's back porch while Emma chased fireflies across the yard in the dark, and the crooked construction paper sun from that first hospital visit was framed, of all places, on the wall just inside the kitchen door, because Natalie had asked if she could keep it, and Jack had said it wasn't his to give away. It was Emma's, and Emma had said Natalie could have it as long as she visited enough to earn it. She had. She did, every week, sometimes twice. "You could have told me the truth that first day," Natalie said, watching Emma's shape move through the dark yard, in my office, before any of it happened. "I could have," Jack agreed, "but you weren't ready to hear it that way. You needed to see it instead." He looked at her, and there wasn't any bitterness left in it, hadn't been for a long time. Some people have to be shown who somebody really is. Telling them doesn't work. Emma came running up onto the porch with cupped hands, a single firefly glowing faintly between her fingers, and held it out to Natalie like an offering. And Natalie cupped her own hands around it and watched it blink once, twice, before Emma let it go back into the dark. "Here's the thing about people like Jack Sullivan. The world is full of them, quiet men and women who show up early, stay late, and never once ask anyone to notice. The ones who absorb the hit so someone smaller doesn't have to, and who are so easy to underestimate precisely because they never ask you not to." It wasn't a title that made him worth trusting. It was 9 years of showing up, and one act of quiet protection that cost him everything, and the fact that, even after all of that, he still walked into a hospital room with soup and a card, because he believed no one should be alone in a place like that. Has someone in your own life ever been the one who quietly took the blame, or the one nobody bothered to check on? Someone written off before anyone took the time to really see them. Tell us who they were in the comments. Even if all you can do now is finally give them the credit you should have given them then. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be seen the way Jack finally was, we'd be glad to have you stick around for more stories like his. Because sometimes the person nobody thought to invite into the room turns out to be the only one who was ever really there. The tray hit the table so hard that the soup jumped its bowl. Scarlett Whitmore's hand froze over her water glass, her whole body going rigid the way it always did when someone approached too fast, too loud, too close. She braced for the apology that would come next, the careful, pitying tone people used with her now, the one that treated hers like something breakable, but no apology came. Instead, the machines were the only sound in the room. A steady beep, a hiss of oxygen, the low electric hum of a hospital at 11 at night. Natalie Parker lay against the raised pillow, with a cast running from her wrist to her elbow, and a bandage taped along her hairline. The tray hit the table so hard that the soup jumped its bowl. Scarlett Whitmore's hand froze over her water glass, her whole body going rigid the way it always did when someone approached too fast, too loud, too close. She braced for the apology that would come next, the careful, pitying tone people used with her now, the one that treated hers like something breakable, but no apology came. Instead, a small voice said, "Is this seat taken?" And Scarlett looked up to find a 7-year-old girl in a yellow rain jacket, 2 sizes too big, already climbing into the chair across from her, dragging a tray of chicken nuggets and apple slices behind her, like she'd done it 100 times before. Behind the girl stood a man in gray coveralls, with Whitmore Industries stitched over the pocket, his face caught somewhere between horror and helpless love, already reaching to pull his daughter back, already forming the words, "I'm so sorry, ma'am, she doesn't unders." Scarlett lifted one hand, just slightly, off the table. Stop. For 3 years, no one had sat across from her without being told to. For 3 years, the executive cafeteria had emptied itself around her, like water around a stone, every table but hers filled, every eye finding somewhere else to land. She had built a fortress out of that empty seat and called it dignity. And now a child with a chicken nugget halfway to her mouth was looking at her the way you look at any other person in the world, no fear in it at all, and asking, "Why do you always sit by yourself?" To find out how 3 people who had no business changing each other's lives ended up rewriting all of them. Stay until the very end. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Scarlett Whitmore was 2 months out of a hospital bed, and 4 months out of a car that had folded around her like paper on the Merritt Parkway. And she had come back to work in a wheelchair because the alternative was letting Whitmore Industries, the company her father built, the company that carried her name on 11 buildings across 4 states, slip out of her hands into the ones circling it. She ran the boardroom the way she always had, precise, unblinking, giving no one the satisfaction of watching her falter. But the cafeteria was different. In the cafeteria, there was no agenda to hide behind. There was just Scarlett and the chair, and 40 employees pretending very hard not to look at either. Ethan Brooks had worked at Whitmore Industries for 6 years, first as a floor tech, now as maintenance supervisor for the executive tower, a promotion that came with better pay and worse hours, and a badge that let him into rooms most people on his level never saw. He was 34 years old and had raised his daughter alone since she was 4. Since the morning his wife Rebecca didn't wake up, an aneurysm the doctors said, quiet and sudden and impossible to have stopped. He didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much. He fixed things, elevators, HVAC systems, the small mechanical failures that kept a 50-story building breathing. And he did it with a kind of stillness that made people trust him without knowing exactly why. Chloe spent her summer days in the maintenance office on the 2nd floor, coloring at a folding table while her father worked, because daycare cost more than Ethan could spare, and there was no one else to call. She was 7, and she noticed things adults had trained themselves not to. She noticed that the woman in the wheelchair by the window always ordered the same soup. She noticed that people's voices changed when they walked past her table, dropping into that careful, over-polite register reserved for funerals and hospital rooms. She noticed most of all that nobody ever sat down. If you've ever watched someone get overlooked because the world decided, without asking, what they could or couldn't handle, you already know why this story matters, and we'd love to hear in the comments if you've seen it happen too. That first lunch lasted 11 minutes. Chloe asked Scarlett if her chair could go fast, and Scarlett, startled into something like a laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember, said it could, actually, quite fast, and if Chloe promised not to tell building security, She'd show her sometime. Ethan said almost nothing, hovering at the edge of the table with his own tray, waiting for a signal to leave that never came. When Scarlett finally looked at him directly, really looked, the way people rarely did anymore, without flinching toward the chair or away from it, she asked what he did in the building, and he told her, plainly, without the apology in his voice that most employees used when describing manual work to someone who signed their checks. She found she wanted to know more. She did not let herself examine why. Whitmore Industries in that season was not a company at ease. Scarlett's accident had cost the board 11 weeks of uncertain leadership, and in that vacuum, a man named Preston Cole had quietly consolidated relationships the way ivy consolidates a wall, pleasant, patient, impossible to notice until it had already taken hold. Cole was Chief Operating Officer, 46, handsome in the specific way of men who'd been told their whole lives that they were destined for rooms like this one, and he had spent the 11 weeks of Scarlett's recovery telling select board members, gently deniably, that perhaps it was time to consider whether a CEO in her condition could still project the strength the company's biggest contract, a $340 million infrastructure deal with the state, one that would define Whitmore Industries for the next decade, required. Scarlett didn't know yet that these conversations were happening. She only knew that Cole's smile had gotten wider since the accident, and that smiles like that had never meant good things for the people underneath them. She ate lunch with Ethan and Chloe the next day, and the day after that. Nobody scheduled it, nobody announced it. It simply became the shape the middle of the day took, the three of them at the corner table by the window, Chloe narrating her drawings in exhaustive detail, Ethan speaking maybe one sentence for every tent of his daughters, Scarlett finding, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was no longer counting the minutes until she could retreat to her office. 3 weeks in, she asked Chloe why she'd walked over that first day. Chloe considered this with the gravity children bring to questions adults have stopped taking seriously. "You looked like the last kid picked for kickball," she said. "I know what that looks like. Nobody should have to eat lunch like that." Scarlett didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she supposed she hadn't either, and something in her chest that had been clenched since the moment of impact on the Merritt Parkway loosened, just slightly, for the first time in 11 months. None of the three of them knew yet that a storm was already gathering above them, one that would test whether the walls Scarlett had built to survive her recovery could survive something far more dangerous than pity. 6 weeks would pass before that storm broke, and by the time it did, all three of their lives would already be too tangled together to separate. The boardroom on the 40th floor had windows on 3 sides, floor to ceiling, and Scarlett had always thought of it as the one room in the building where she felt entirely herself, entirely in command. On a Tuesday in late July, that stopped being true. Preston Cole had called the meeting himself, framing it to the board as a strategic continuity discussion, language bland enough that Scarlett hadn't flagged it as a threat until she was already seated at the head of the table and Cole was already standing, a slide deck already glowing on the screen behind him. The deck was titled Leadership Resilience and the Sinclair Infrastructure Contract. Scarlett understood, within the first 90 seconds, exactly what was happening to her. Cole spoke gently, which made it worse. He spoke about optics, about the state contract negotiators, men in their 60s who Cole suggested, without ever quite saying it, might read a CEO's visible disability as a liability during site visits that would require, he said, physical stamina and presence. He spoke about a leave of absence, paid, generous, framed as care rather than removal, during which he would step in as acting CEO through the contract's finalization. He used the word temporary 4 times. He never once looked at the wheelchair. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood what the presentation was actually about. Scarlett sat through 11 minutes of it without moving, her hands flat on the table, her face doing the thing it had learned to do in hospital rooms and physical therapy sessions, and every meeting since the accident where she needed no one to see what it cost her to hold still. When Cole finished, she said only, "I'll consider it," and the board, watching her, seemed to take her composure as confirmation that Cole was right, that something in her had gone quiet and small since the crash, that she could be managed now in a way the old Scarlett Whitmore never could have been. She did not go to the executive cafeteria that day. She had her assistant cancel the reservation on the corner table and ate nothing at all, alone in her office, staring at the state contract's cover sheet until the words stopped meaning anything. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. He and Chloe had come down at their usual time, trays in hand, and found the table by the window empty for the first time in 6 weeks. Chloe's face fell in a way that made something in Ethan's chest tighten, and he told her, gently, that grown-ups had bad days sometimes, that it didn't mean anything had changed. He didn't fully believe it himself. 2 days later, Scarlett returned to the cafeteria, but something in her had gone flat, guarded. Retreating back toward the fortress she'd spent 6 weeks quietly dismantling, she was polite. She asked Chloe about her drawings. But Ethan, who had spent years reading the small, involuntary signs of exhaustion and grief on his own face in mirrors, he tried to avoid, recognized the same signs now on hers, and understood that something had happened above his pay grade, in rooms he'd never be invited into. He said nothing about it. It wasn't his place, and he'd learned the hard way, in the years since Rebecca died, that grief and pressure needed space before they needed questions. What he didn't yet know was that his own name had entered Preston Cole's calculations that same week. A junior facilities auditor named Miriam Ostrander, sharp, underpaid, 3 years into a job that asked more of her than it paid for, had been quietly reviewing maintenance contracts as part of a routine cost audit when she noticed an irregularity in a vendor account tied to the 40th floor's environmental systems, a shell company billing Whitmore Industries nearly $40,000 a month for servicing equipment that, according to Ethan's own maintenance logs, had been decommissioned 8 months earlier. She brought it first to her direct supervisor, who told her, uneasily, to let it go, that the account had been set up under Cole's authorization, and it wasn't her place to question executive spending. Miriam did not let it go. She simply stopped talking about it out loud and started making copies. Ethan had no idea any of this was happening. What he knew was smaller and more immediate, that the woman his daughter had grown to love, in the uncomplicated way children love people who are kind to them, was disappearing back into whatever version of herself had existed before that first lunch, and there was nothing he could do about it that wouldn't overstep a line he had no right to cross. The breaking point came on a Friday. Cole, sensing an opening, escalated. He called Scarlett into his office, a small, telling inversion of the usual order, and told her, with the same gentle, unbearable reasonableness as before, that 3 board members had now expressed concerns, that the Sinclair negotiators had specifically asked, through back channels, whether the CEO overseeing the contract would be the same one they'd have expected before the accident. He suggested, one more time, the leave of absence. He suggested it would look better, for everyone, including her legacy, if it appeared to be her choice. Scarlett left his office and did not go back to her own. She went instead to the loading dock stairwell, the one place in the building, with no cameras and no assistants and no board members. And she sat there for 11 minutes with her hands pressed against her eyes, refusing, out of pure will, to let herself cry in a building that already thought she was too fragile to run it. She did not go to the cafeteria that day either, and the day after, Ethan found a note taped to the corner table, not from Scarlett but from Building Services, reassigning the table's reservation. It was a small, bureaucratic thing, the kind of erasure that happens in offices every day, without anyone intending cruelty by it. But Chloe saw the note before Ethan could take it down, and asked, in the flat, devastated voice of a child encountering unfairness for the first time, why the lady in the wheelchair wasn't allowed to sit with them anymore. Ethan didn't have an answer. He only knew, standing there with his daughter's hand in his, that something had gone wrong 3 floors above his understanding, and that the quiet had returned to the cafeteria the way it had before Chloe walked across it with 2 trays and no fear at all. Whoever you are watching this, if you've ever been the one people quietly stopped making room for, pushed out of a seat, a role, a life you'd built, without anyone ever explaining why, tell us in the comments. So many of you watching have lived exactly this, and it deserves to be said out loud. 3 weeks would pass in that silence before the truth. Miriam Ostrander had been quietly documenting finally found its way into the one place. Preston Cole couldn't control it. Miriam Ostrander did not go looking for a hero. She went looking for someone in the building who understood mechanical systems well enough to confirm what she already suspected, that the phantom maintenance contract wasn't a paperwork error, but a deliberate, ongoing theft, dressed up in enough technical language to survive a cursory glance. She found her way, eventually, to Ethan Brooks, because his name was on the decommissioning logs the shell company's invoices contradicted, and because two people in accounting, off the record, told her he was the one person in the building who wouldn't be intimidated into silence by a title. She was right about that, though it took her 3 attempts to get Ethan to actually look at the documents instead of waving her toward his supervisor. When he finally sat down with the invoices in the empty maintenance office after his shift, Chloe asleep on the office couch with her jacket as a blanket, he went quiet in the specific way Miriam would later describe to Scarlett as, like watching a man do math he already knew the answer to, and hoping he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. The equipment had been stripped and sold 8 months earlier. He'd filed the paperwork himself. Someone had kept billing for its maintenance anyway, routing the payments through a company registered, according to public filings, Miriam had already pulled, to an address 6 blocks from Preston Cole's apartment. Ethan asked her carefully what she planned to do with it. Miriam admitted she didn't know. Her supervisor had already warned her off once. Going over his head meant going to a board that, as far as either of them could tell, was already leaning toward trusting Cole over the CEO he was quietly maneuvering to replace. It was Ethan who suggested, quietly, that the person who most needed to see the documents wasn't the board at all. It was Scarlett. He found her, 3 days later, not in the cafeteria. She still hadn't returned, but in the loading dock stairwell where she'd taken to eating alone, a habit he'd noticed only because he serviced the stairwell's lighting twice a month, and had started, without fully admitting it to himself, timing his rounds around lunch. He didn't announce himself gently. He simply sat down 2 steps below her, set a folder on the step between them, and told her what Miriam had found. Scarlett read the documents in silence, her face unreadable in the way it had been trained to be unreadable through a decade of board meetings. But her hands, Ethan noticed, had gone very still around the folder's edges. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about the money. It was about Cole, about 11 months of a man smiling at her across conference tables, while quietly building the case that she wasn't fit to sit at the head of them. She asked Ethan, then, why he was bringing this to her, instead of walking away from something that clearly wasn't his fight. He told her the truth, plain and unadorned the way he told most truths, that he'd spent 3 years after Rebecca died, learning exactly what it felt like when the people around you decided, without asking, what you could and couldn't handle anymore. His own supervisors had quietly stopped giving him bigger projects after her death, assuming grief had made him unreliable, and it had taken him 2 years to earn that trust back. He wasn't going to watch it happen to someone else without saying something, chair or no chair. Scarlett looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked quietly whether he'd consider coming back to the cafeteria tomorrow. Chloe had asked about her 3 times that week, apparently, and Scarlett found she'd missed being asked about at all. He said they would. The secondary crisis arrived 4 days later, faster than any of them expected. Cole, sensing the board's patience with the transition conversation thinning, moved to force the issue, calling an emergency board session and proposing a formal vote on a 90-day medical leave, framed with just enough plausible concern that 2 board members who'd been wavering seemed ready to support it. Scarlett had 18 hours notice before the vote. She spent most of them not in her office, but back in the maintenance department, going through the phantom contracts paper trail with Miriam and Ethan, building something more solid than suspicion. What they found, in those 18 hours, went further than either Ethan or Miriam had realized. The shell company wasn't just billing for decommissioned equipment. It had been used, over the previous 14 months, to quietly siphon funds through 3 other departments, always at amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic audit flags. Always timed around board meetings where Cole had positioned himself as the fiscally cautious alternative to what he called, in one recovered internal email, Whitmore's post-accident spending instincts. The email was dated 6 weeks after Scarlett's crash. He had been building this case since before she'd even left the hospital. Scarlett read that email twice. Ethan watched something shift behind her eyes. Not the guarded stillness he'd grown used to, but something colder and considerably more dangerous to whoever stood on the other side of it. She did not go into the emergency board session hoping to survive it. She went in intending to end it. 1 week later, an ordinary Wednesday morning would put all three of them, Scarlett, Ethan, and a folder of evidence neither the board nor Preston Cole had any idea existed yet, in the same room for a confrontation that would decide far more than who sat at the head of Whitmore Industries. The boardroom was full by 9:02, all 11 members present. Cole seated near the head of the table, with the easy posture of a man who'd already counted his votes. Scarlett arrived at 9:04, and for the first time in 11 months, she did not arrive alone. Ethan stood by the door, out of place in coveralls in a room full of tailored suits, holding a folder he had no formal authority to present and no intention of leaving without presenting. Cole's smile flickered when he saw him. It was the first honest expression Scarlett had seen on his face in months. She did not sit at the head of the table. She wheeled to the front of the room instead, beside the projection screen, and told the board, calmly, that before any vote on her leadership was taken, they were going to look at something. She nodded to Ethan. What followed was not a performance built for drama. It was precise, specific, and devastating in exactly the way Ethan had learned, over 6 years of maintenance logs and equipment audits, to make a case airtight. Decommissioning records dated and signed, cross-referenced against invoices for equipment that no longer existed. A shell company's registered address matched, document by document, to Cole's own apartment building, and finally, the recovered email, 6 weeks post-accident, in which Cole had described Scarlett's leadership in language he'd never once used to her face. Miriam, waiting outside, was called in to confirm the audit trail herself, her voice shaking at first and then steadying as she realized, watching the board's faces change, that she was finally being believed. Cole tried, for the first 4 minutes, to hold his composure. This was, he said, a misunderstanding, an old contract improperly closed out. He'd need time to review it himself. But the board had watched 100 executives lie to them before, and the particular quality of panic now moving under Cole's careful language was not one that misunderstandings produced. By minute 7, a board member Scarlett had assumed was firmly in Cole's corner asked, flatly, why a maintenance contract would be registered to his personal residence. Cole had no answer that survived contact with the question. It was Ethan, not Scarlett, who delivered the detail that finally cornered him completely. A small, technical fact only someone who'd actually walked the building's mechanical systems would know, that the decommissioned equipment in question had been physically removed and sold for parts. Its serial numbers logged with the State Recycling Authority, meaning the Mainton Coles Shell Company had billed for 8 months of service on a machine that had been cut apart and sold for scrap 11 months ago. There was no version of that discrepancy that could be explained as an accounting error. Cole understood this before anyone said it aloud. His face, for just a moment, lost the performance entirely. The board voted, that same morning, not on Scarlett's leave of absence, but on Cole's immediate termination, pending a full forensic audit and referral to the district attorney's office for what appeared, on preliminary review, to be a sustained pattern of corporate fraud. Cole was escorted from the building by security before noon. He did not look at Scarlett on his way out. He looked, instead, at Ethan, with an expression that had nothing reasonable left in it at all. The board, shaken and chastened, turned to Scarlett expecting some acknowledgement of vindication, some triumphant word for the record. She gave them almost nothing. She thanked them for their time, confirmed the forensic audit would proceed under independent counsel, and adjourned the meeting 11 minutes after it had been scheduled to end. It was only afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, that she let herself stop holding the shape she'd held for the last 2 hours. Ethan found her there, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Scarlett quietly asked him how long he'd known, not about the fraud, but about what it had cost her, these last 11 months. To hold herself together in a building full of people deciding what she was still capable of. He told her he hadn't known the details. He'd only recognized the shape of it because he'd worn something like it himself. She did not cry in the hallway, but something in her posture, watching him, softened in a way the board would never have recognized as the same woman who'd just ended a man's career with 11 minutes of documentation and a closed, composed face. What none of them yet knew, not Scarlett, not Ethan, not even Miriam, who was already being quietly reassigned to a new role in internal audit as thanks for her courage, was that the story of that morning would not stay contained inside the boardroom. 2 months would pass before it found its way, in fragments and then in full, to every desk in the building, and by the time it did, it would ask something of Scarlett Whitmore that no board vote ever could. The story didn't leak all at once. It arrived the way most true things eventually do inside a large company, first as a rumor in the break room, then as a confirmed fact in an internal memo announcing Cole's termination for cause. Then finally, as something closer to the whole truth, when Miriam, newly settled into internal audit and no longer afraid of losing a job she'd nearly lost anyway, quietly corrected the breakroom version for anyone who asked. By the time 2 months had passed, most of Whitmore Industries knew roughly what had happened on that Wednesday morning in the boardroom, and knew, too, who had been standing by the door with a folder he had no formal right to present. Scarlett could have kept it contained to the executive floor. She chose not to. At the company's quarterly all-hands meeting, held that fall in the atrium where 400 employees gathered under skylights that had cost more than some of their salaries, she sat, at the front, in the chair she no longer flinched from being seen in, and told them, without theater, what had actually happened over the previous year. She named Cole's fraud plainly. She named the auditor who'd found it and refused to let it go. And she named Ethan Brooks, not as a footnote, but as the reason the company still had a leader at all. A maintenance supervisor who had no obligation to involve himself in a fight far above his position, and who had done it anyway because he recognized, in a stranger, the same quiet erasure he'd once survived himself. The applause that followed was not the point, though it came anyway, long and unplanned and full of people who had spent a year averting their eyes from a woman in a wheelchair, now looking directly at her. What mattered more happened privately, the next week, when Scarlett called Ethan into her office and offered him a title that would have doubled his salary and moved him permanently to the executive floor, Director of Facilities Integrity, a role invented transparently to keep him close. He turned it down, gently, the way he turned down most things offered too quickly. He didn't want the title, he told her. He wanted the same thing Miriam had needed and nearly not gotten. A system where the next person who noticed something wrong wouldn't have to risk their job to say so. He asked instead for something smaller and harder to give, a formal, protected reporting channel, independent of any single executive, that any employee at any level could use without fear. Scarlett approved it within the week. It still bears quietly, in the internal documentation nobody outside the company will ever read, the name of a maintenance supervisor who never wanted credit for it. The quiet coda came months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable afternoon that never makes it into anyone's account of a story, except the people who lived it. The corner table by the cafeteria window had a permanent reservation sign on it now, small and unofficial, that no one had ever formally authorized and no one had ever removed. Scarlett sat there, as she did most days, and Ethan and Chloe joined her, as they did most days. Chloe now ate and considerably more opinionated about her drawings than she'd been the summer before. At some point in the meal, Chloe asked Scarlett, with the same unfiltered directness that had started all of this, whether she was going to be around for her birthday in the spring. Scarlett looked at Ethan first. A small private question passed between two adults who had spent a year learning to trust each other slowly, deliberately, without either of them rushing what neither wanted to break. And then looked back at Chloe and said that she wouldn't miss it for anything. It was such a small exchange. No one in the cafeteria that day would have known, watching it, that it marked the end of anything, or the beginning of anything else. But Ethan, watching his daughter's face when Scarlett answered, understood that some things repair themselves not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary Tuesdays, chosen again and again, until one day you look up and realize the empty seat across the table has been filled for so long you can no longer quite remember what the silence used to sound like. If there's a person in your own life who got quietly written off, underestimated, overlooked, decided about before anyone actually asked them who they were. We'd genuinely like to know who they are. Naming them, even here in the comments, is its own small act of giving them back what got taken. Scarlett Whitmore still runs Whitmore Industries from a wheelchair, and no one in that building flinches at it anymore. Not because of a policy or a memo, but because a 7-year-old girl once looked at a woman eating alone and decided, without being told to, that nobody should have to. If you'd like to see where the rest of their story goes, we'll be here, and we'd love to have you stay part of it. The application sat on the glass desk for exactly 4 seconds before Victoria Reynolds stopped breathing. She had read hundreds of these that quarter. HR sent her the janitorial hires now only because she'd insisted on it, a strange executive habit nobody questioned anymore. The woman who built a $12 billion aerospace company but still wanted to see who mopped its floors. Most names meant nothing. This one did. She read it again, certain her eyes were doing what tired eyes do at the end of a 14-hour day, inventing familiar shapes out of strangers' names. But it stayed the same the second time, and the third. Mason Carter. Her pen, mid-signature on the folder beneath it, stopped moving. Across the small interview room, the man himself sat with his hands folded in his lap, a resume in a plain blue folder, a canvas jacket with a frayed cuff, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to expect much from rooms like this one. He didn't fidget, he didn't perform. He answered the recruiter's questions in short, complete sentences, and when asked why he wanted the janitorial position at Reynolds Aerodyne, he said only that the hours worked around his daughter's school schedule, and that he was good at fixing things quietly. Victoria set the pen down. "Mason Carter?" she said, and her voice betrayed her, thin in a way it never was in board meetings. He looked up. For half a second something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe dread. Before he folded it back into stillness the way she imagined he'd folded away 100 other things. "Yes, ma'am." The folder in her hands trembled, just slightly, and she set it down too fast, and it slid off the edge of the desk and hit the floor loud enough that the recruiter jumped. Victoria did not move to pick it up. She was looking at the man across from her the way you look at a ghost you owe money to find out how a janitor's application ended up freezing one of the most powerful women in American industry, and what she chose to do next, stay until the very end. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the $12 billion valuation, not the glass tower with her name etched into the lobby floor, not even the company itself in any form that resembled what it would become. 3 years earlier, Victoria Reynolds was 31 years old, and 6 weeks from losing everything. Her startup, back then just called Reynolds Propulsion, had one working prototype, 4 remaining employees, and a defense contract that would collapse the moment its engineers discovered, as they eventually would, that the core engine design had a catastrophic thermal flaw nobody on her small, exhausted team could solve. She had already signed the lease renewal she couldn't afford. She had already told her father, who'd mortgaged his house to seed her first round, that everything was on track. It was not on track. Reynolds Propulsion was 6 weeks from a contract cancellation that would have ended the company, buried her credibility in the industry, and put her father's house on the market. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for 3 years, was that an anonymous submission arrived in her company's technical review inbox that spring. A complete engine redesign, correcting the thermal flaw with an elegance her own engineers couldn't replicate, attached to no name, no invoice, no request for royalties or credit. Just the math, clean and total, solving in 11 pages what her team had failed to solve in 11 months. Her lead engineer at the time assumed it came from a consulting firm they'd once floated a partnership with. Nobody asked further. The deadline was too close, the fix too good, and Victoria signed off on implementing it without ever learning whose mind it had come from. The contract was saved. The company survived. Eventually it became what it was now. Towers, thousands of employees, government contracts spanning 3 continents, built unknowingly on the back of a man she'd never met. That man was Mason Carter, and at the time he submitted those 11 pages, he was one of the most respected propulsion engineers at Halbrook Dynamics, a firm twice Reynolds' size, where he'd spent 9 years building a reputation for exactly the kind of quiet, exacting brilliance that made junior engineers nervous to disagree with him in meetings. He had a wife, Elena, a high school chemistry teacher, with a laugh people described as the best thing about the building. He had a 2-year-old daughter, Lily, whose photograph sat on his desk in a frame he'd built himself out of aircraft-grade aluminum scrap, a joke between him and Elena that their daughter deserved engineering-grade love. He sent Victoria's team that redesigned not for money and not for credit, but because a former colleague at Reynolds, someone he'd mentored years earlier, had called him in a panic, and he could not stand the thought of good engineers going under for a solvable problem. It took him 4 nights. He asked for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement, because at Halbrook, moonlighting for a competitor, however unpaid, however anonymous, was a fireable offense, and Mason had a mortgage and a daughter, and no interest in risking either over something he considered simple decency. 6 months later, Elena was killed in a highway collision on her drive home from a parent-teacher conference. A drunk driver crossing the median at 71 miles an hour. Mason was left, at 34, with a 3-year-old daughter, a house that suddenly felt enormous, and a mind that could no longer hold engineering problems the way it once had, because it was too busy holding grief. He did not tell his employer why his output slowed. He did not tell them about the nights he sat on Lily's bedroom floor at 3 a.m., because it was the only place in the house that didn't feel like Elena's absence. Halbrook Dynamics did not ask kindly. Within a year, quietly, without any public announcement, Mason Carter was managed out. His projects reassigned, his name removed from patents he'd co-invented, his reputation allowed to erode under the story, spread by a rising colleague named Derek Holt, that Mason had lost his edge after his wife's death and simply couldn't be trusted with critical systems anymore. At the time, Victoria Reynolds knew none of this. She was 3 states away, building the company his silent gift had saved, never once learning the engineer's name. If you've ever watched someone build a life on a kindness they never knew they'd received, you understand exactly the moment waiting at the end of this story. And if these overlooked hero stories mean something to you, the way they seem to mean something to so many of you watching, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. Now, 3 years later, in a glass interview room on the 41st floor of the company Mason's quiet genius had saved, Victoria Reynolds stared at his resume and did not yet understand any of it. She only knew the name. She only knew, somewhere underneath the shock, that a debt she hadn't known she owed had just walked into her building wearing a canvas